Hi everyone, I hope you are doing well. In this video, we are going to see some Apex Trigger interview questions. So this is the first part of it. Here we are going to cover some basics and some medium complex questions, and then there is one more video for Apex Triggers where I have covered some tricky questions. So do check out that video as well. So I'm going to start with basic questions, pretty common questions, very straightforward. What are Trigger.new and Trigger.old variables? So they are just list of what is being inserted or updated. So Trigger.new is list of new records and Trigger.old is list of old records before the update or deletion occurred, means the existing copy of records. So all the existing field values is nothing but Trigger.old, and the new values of fields are Trigger.new. Okay, and both are list data type. Then context variables in Apex triggers. So context variables are going to provide you metadata. So metadata about what? About trigger execution. So what is getting executed and what is getting processed, that metadata you will get in this context variables. Then as I said, Trigger.new and Trigger.old is list of new records and old records. Then the same version we have in map, Trigger.new map, it's map of record IDs and new records, similar to Trigger.new. And Trigger.old map is again map of record IDs to old records. So all the field values would have existing values which are present on record in old map, and new map is about the new values, those are getting inserted or updated on the record. Okay, so that collection is stored in new map and existing collection is stored in old map. Okay, then the third question is, can we perform a DML operation in a before trigger? Why or why not? So on the same object, you should not perform explicit DML again, because the record is itself getting saved and your trigger is executing in between that transaction. So the record is going to get saved anyway. Okay, so you should not perform explicit DML, because the DML is bound to happen, because the record is going to save in the database and your before trigger is going to execute before that. So whatever you want to assign, any value you can directly assign to this Trigger.new inside the for loop, and that will get saved automatically without requiring DML. And suppose you try to perform DML, then it can cause recursions, because it's going to trigger the trigger again and again and again. Now interviewer can ask you that, can you perform DML operation on related object or on unrelated object? So obviously on the same object you cannot, but on the related, or you can query something and then update it or then insert it, that is fine. Okay, then the next question is, what are some best practices for writing Apex triggers? So this is again very common question. You can just state these 4 points. These are pretty enough. First is single trigger per object for maintainability. Again you can create more, but the single trigger is recommended per object. Okay, then the second thing is separating business logic into handler classes. So we do not recommend writing logic inside Apex triggers. So Apex triggers would call handler classes and the logic will reside in handler class. Okay, so the Apex trigger will just call handler and then handler will execute the logic. Okay, then the third best practice is, we have to ensure bulkification. So your trigger should not just work for single record, the logic should work for bulk records. Okay, so the logic should be able to handle bulk 1000, 10,000 records effectively without hitting any governor limits. Okay, so the code should be bulkified, and then you have to implement error handling. So the start to end, single trigger per object, move the logic to handler class, bulkify it, and make sure to add error handling in it. Okay, now how to ensure bulkification in Apex trigger? So we know that Salesforce has limits and we have to bulkify the code. So to ensure bulkification in Apex trigger, you have to use collections, you have to use lists and maps. So basically you don't have to do any updates inside for loop, you don't have to do any queries inside the loop. Okay, whatever you have to update, collect it in the list or map and then update it outside loop, insert it outside for loop. Okay, So basically your code should handle if 1000 records are getting inserted or 1000 records are getting updated, the code should collect them in list or maps, then update it once per the trigger at the end of the code or in between the code as per your logic, and do sockets if necessary. Okay, basically if you have trigger.new variable, you won't need socket on the same object, because the trigger.new or trigger.new map will have the copy of the same records, so you can use that as well. So this is how you are going to bulkify your apex trigger. Then what is recursion in triggers and how do you avoid it? So I have in detail video on this, very interesting question. So basically recursion is going to occur if your trigger is calling itself again and again, directly or indirectly. So it may happen that you have related object and then you have written trigger for on that, and then you're again updating the same object. Now how to prevent it? So you have to use static variable. So if you see that this is my trigger on account, okay, and this is the trigger utility class, and I am making sure that if once my trigger is executed, I am marking it true. Okay, the default value was false, but once the trigger is executed for one time, then I am marking it true, and in the next run I am not going to execute the business logic again. So the recursion is not going to occur if you put such flags, but those flags should be static variables. Okay, so static variables are going to retain the value throughout the transaction. Okay, so even if this trigger is finished over here and some other trigger updates the account, and suppose this trigger again tries to fire, this variable is still holding the value, this variable is still retaining the value, it's still true. So unless it is false, it is not going to execute the business logic again. Okay, so this is how you are going to avoid recursion in trigger, okay, by using static variables. Then the next question is, can we write multiple triggers on the same object? What are the risks? So basically we can write multiple triggers on the same object, but it is not recommended, and Salesforce does not guarantee the execution order when multiple triggers exist on the same object. So basically try to write a single trigger per object. Okay, how can you dynamically disable an apex trigger without modifying the code? So if you know, you cannot deactivate an apex trigger inside production org. Okay, so in sandboxes you can deactivate it if something goes wrong, but in prod, if you have to deactivate apex trigger, what will you do? So basically here what is recommended, you have to use custom setting or custom metadata. So if you see that here custom setting disable trigger is created in the system, and suppose if this disable trigger is true, then the trigger is going to be bypassed, so no logic is going to execute. Okay, so this variable has to be false to execute your trigger. So basically you just have to go to custom setting or custom metadata and create a boolean variable, and then make sure to check it before running the trigger, and then your trigger will be indirectly disabled or deactivated. So it will be still active, it will be still triggering, but the logic will be bypassed, the logic will not get executed. Okay, so in this way you can dynamically disable it without touching the actual apex trigger. Okay, then the next question is, how do you ensure that an apex trigger does not execute for records updated by a batch job but still executes for UI and API updates? So basically you want to bypass apex trigger when it is running through batch job. So some object gets updated through batch job, at that time you just want to bypass your apex trigger. So basically you have this indicator, you have this syntax called system.isBatch. Okay, so this is going to be true if the transaction is running in the batch. Okay, so this is your trigger. Okay, now you can check that if system.isBatch is true and then just return. So this is going to prevent the trigger execution for batch jobs, and for UI and API updates it's still going to execute it. Okay, so just remember system.isBatch. Okay, Then the next question is, how can you ensure that trigger does not modify fields that the user does not have permission to edit? Now, as you know, the Apex runs in system mode by default, so it assumes that the user has necessary access. So even if you don't have direct access to something, the Apex will give you that access because it is running in the system mode. Now, how to control that and how to enforce the field level security or object level security, how to enforce that in Trigger? So first thing is, you have to use is updatable or is creatable such methods before updating or inserting something. So this is for individual field checks. Then for SOQL queries, so this is about read operation. So you will be reading fields through SOQL queries. So if you want to control what fields you are fetching, then you can add this keyword with security enforced inside your SOQL query. So this is going to make sure that you fetch only those fields where you have access. Okay. Now this is the new and latest keyword, security.strip inaccessible. So this is going to strip the fields where you don't have access. So this is going to run your code without giving any exceptions, because it's automatically going to strip the unnecessary fields, inaccessible fields. Okay, so this is again helpful, security.strip inaccessible. Then again, you can use custom permission to enable or disable certain parts of logic for certain users. So if you don't want to go to again field level security or object level security, and you just want to execute something for only certain users, or if you want to disable some logic only for certain users, then you can use custom permissions. Okay, so these are few things that will enforce the security in Trigger level. Okay. Then the next question is, how can you prevent mixed DML errors inside an Apex trigger? We know that mixed DML means you are trying to update setup object like user, profile, role, and non-setup object means our normal day-to-day object, account, contact. So if you try to update these two types of objects in the same transaction, then you will get a mixed DML error. Now, how to avoid it in Trigger? Okay, so basically you are going to use future method again here in the trigger to separate those transactions. So one transaction you will do inside trigger and other transaction you will do in the future method. So it will look like this. So here trigger is on account, so this is going to do update or insert on account. So here the first DML is going to happen in the trigger on account. Okay, now we want to segregate the second DML happening on the users. So this is again a setup account, setup object. So we are going to call the future method. So this is my class in the future method, update user. So I'm going to call this method and pass the list of users to update. So this transaction is running differently than the trigger transaction. Okay, so this is how you can avoid mixed DML error, just by separating transaction by calling future method inside trigger. Okay, so these were few questions around Apex triggers. If you want to go into more complex and tricky questions like this, then do check out my other video on Apex triggers. It has some interesting questions. If you have liked this video, please press the like button and subscribe to my channel. And for more details on how you can reach out to me for training or mock interviews, do check out the description section. Thank you.